The aging innkeeper waited at the ferry landing. A pregnant widow arrived alone. The chain on the ferry bell had been rusting since spring. I'd meant to replace it before the season turned, but seasons had a way of turning without asking, and the chain was still rusting when I heard it clang on a Thursday in late October, just after the light had gone from yellow to orange, and the river had gone from quick to slow. I'd been filling the woodbox on the east porch of the inn when the bell rang. Not unusual. The ferry ran until dark most days, and travelers came in with the chill the way insects came in with the heat, without invitation, and in whatever condition the road had left them. I set the last 2 logs in the box and straightened, and my back told me what it always told me when I straightened too fast. I ignored it the way I always ignored it, and I went down to the landing. My name is Harlan Foss. I've kept the Foss Ferry Inn at the Cimarron Crossing for 22 years. The ferry itself, a flat-bottomed rope ferry that crossed 40 feet of brown water, belonged to the county. I paid a lease and kept the apparatus, and in return I ran the inn and the small stable on the north side of the building, and I fed and sheltered whoever arrived. That was the arrangement. That was the life. I had made my peace with it some years back, which is a thing a man says when he means he stopped waiting for something else. The ferryman that October was a Tejano named Paz who had worked the rope for 3 seasons running and never said more than 10 words in a stretch. He was easing the flatboat in when I came down the bank, and there were 2 men on the far side of the rope he was hauling against drifters, by the look of their blanket rolls, heading east for winter work. And there was 1 person on the near side of the ferry already unloading. I say person because it took me a moment to sort out the particulars in the failing light. She was young, younger than I'd first thought. She had a wool coat the color of old mud that was fastened wrong across the front, 2 buttons off by 1 notch, which I noticed before I noticed anything else, and which I noticed because it meant she'd dressed in a hurry or in the dark or while too tired to count. She had a traveling bag, heavy canvas, hanging from 1 hand, and she was favoring her left side when she stepped off the deck onto the mud and gravel of the landing. She had dark hair, almost black in the dusk, pulled back in a way that said it had started neat that morning and given up by midday. And she was pregnant, well along, 7 months maybe closer to 8. She looked up when I came down the bank. She didn't ask for anything. She just looked at me in the way that a person looks when they have been assessing strangers all day and are very tired of having to do it. I said, "Inn's back up the path. You can get supper and a room." She said, "How much?" I told her the rate. She didn't flinch, which told me she had money or at least enough of it. She nodded once and started up the path without waiting to see if I'd come along. I came along. I took the heavy canvas bag from her before she'd gone 10 steps, and she let me take it without argument, which also told me something. A woman with anything left to prove doesn't let you take the bag. She was past proving anything. She just needed to sit down. Her name was Delia Marsh. She told me that at supper when I set a plate in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment like she was deciding whether to cry or eat, and then she ate. Delia Marsh, late of Springer, up in New Mexico territory. Her husband, Tom Marsh, had been a freight agent. He'd been dead since August. A horse had fallen on him in a canyon. That was how she put it. A horse had fallen on him in a canyon. She wasn't looking for pity when she said it. She was just telling me the facts so I'd understand the situation, which was that she was traveling to her sister in Caldwell, Kansas, because Springer held nothing anymore and her sister held a house and a husband who had work. She ate everything on the plate. She drank 2 cups of the chicory coffee I kept on the stove, and she thanked me for both. I showed her to the room at the end of the upstairs hall, the one with the south window that got the morning sun. It was the best room I had, and it wasn't occupied. I didn't tell her it was the best room. I just put her in it. I went back downstairs and washed the plate and cup, and I stood at the kitchen window for a while looking at the river, and I didn't think about anything in particular. Or that's what I told myself. What I was actually doing was listening to the quiet of the building around me, which had a different quality than usual. There was someone in the upstairs room. That should not have been notable. There were often someone in the upstairs rooms. But this was a different quiet. I can't explain it better than that. She planned to take the stage east in the morning. There was a stage road 6 miles north, and the morning coach came through at 9. I said I'd have the buckboard ready at 7:30 to get her to the road in time. That was the plan. At 4 in the morning she knocked on the door at the bottom of the staircase, and I heard it because I was a light sleeper and had been for years, and I came out of the back room with my boots already half on. She was standing at the top of the stairs, holding the railing with both hands. She said, "I think something's wrong." I'm not a doctor. I want to be clear about that. I was not then and I am not now. But I had delivered 2 calves in my life and sat with my wife when she labored with our son, and I knew enough to know what wrong looked like and enough to know there are things that can be done and things that cannot. She was having pains too early and too close together, and her face told me it had been going on since midnight, and she'd waited as long as she could before knocking. I got her back to the room. I built up the fire in the small iron stove in the corner until the room was warm. I rode out in the dark to get the Navarro woman, who lived 2 miles south along the river and who had midwifed half the babies born in that valley over the past 15 years. Her name was Celestina, and she came back with me without a word, just pulled on her coat and tied her bag shut and climbed up onto the seat beside me, and we went back through the dark at a trot. I waited downstairs. That's all there was to do. I made coffee and I kept the fire stoked and I listened to the sounds of the house. At 6:17 in the morning, by the clock above the kitchen door, there was a thin, sharp cry from upstairs, and then quiet, and then Celestina appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at me. "Boy," she said, "both well." I sat down in the chair by the kitchen stove, and I put my hands on my knees, and I looked at the floorboards for a while. She couldn't travel, that was obvious. She had $2.60 left after paying what she owed me through that first night, and a baby born 5 weeks early, and nowhere to go that wasn't 6 miles of rough road away, followed by 3 days of stage travel. I told her she'd stay until the boy was strong enough to make the trip, and she was strong enough to make it with him. I didn't ask her if that suited her. I told her. I was not trying to be hard about it. I just knew that if I asked, she might argue, and arguing would have wasted both our time because she was not in a position to argue and I was not going to change my mind. She looked at me for a moment with those dark eyes of hers, and she said, "Mr. Foss, what do you charge for a room long-term?" I told her the rate was room and board, and she could help in the kitchen when she was on her feet, if she wanted something to do with herself. That was the rate. She said, "That's not a real rate." I said it was the rate I was giving. She looked at me another moment, then she said, "All right." The baby, she named him Thomas for his father, was small but he was loud when he wanted to be, and he was healthy in the ways that counted. I set up the crib from the storage room and put it in the south room next to her bed, and I went back to the work of the inn, which never stopped because the ferry never stopped. There was work enough for all of it. The ferry brought travelers in 1s and 2s and occasional groups, and they needed feeding and bedding down, and the stable needed tending, and the woodpiles needed replenishing, and the supply wagon from Raton came through on Tuesdays and needed unloading. I did what I always did. I got up before light and I worked until dark and I went asleep. The only difference was that the building was not quiet in the same way anymore. There was someone in it. Delia came downstairs on the 5th day, moving carefully, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the breakfast I was making and said she'd take over the cooking if that was agreeable. I told her it was agreeable. She cooked. She was a better cook than I was, which I acknowledged freely, and she acknowledged the acknowledgement without making anything of it, and that was the beginning of something I didn't know the name for yet. There were men who came through the landing that fall who said things. I want to set that down plainly because it is part of what happened. A cattle broker out of Amarillo, who'd come through before and had opinions about everything, said what he said at supper one evening. He didn't say it loudly. He leaned across to the man next to him, another traveler, a surveyor from the look of him, and he said what he said in the way that men say things when they want to be heard but don't want to be accountable for saying them. I was filling a coffee pot at the stove. Delia was at the far end of the kitchen washing up. I don't know if she heard. I suspect she did. I set the coffee pot down. I turned around. I said, "Finish your supper and settle your account and ride on." The broker looked up at me. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. There is a kind of quiet a man has when he is standing in his own house and has made a decision that isn't going to be unmade, and it has nothing to do with raising his voice or putting his hand on anything. The broker looked at me for 3 seconds, and then he looked down at his plate and finished his supper and paid and rode on. The surveyor, whose name turned out to be Aldecoa, and who was a decent man, finished his supper too and paid and then stopped at the door and said, "That was well handled, Mr. Foss." He went out. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. Delia came out of the kitchen. She stood next to me, close but not touching, and she looked out the window at the dark yard, and after a while she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "Yes, I did." She didn't say anything else about it, but I noticed after that when she came into a room I was in, she stood a little closer than she had before, not by much, just differently. November came. The river dropped to its fall level, shallow and brown, and the cottonwoods along the bank went from green to yellow to gone in about 2 weeks, the way they always did. The ferry traffic slowed as it always slowed. The days got cold, and the cold got into things: the hinges, the water in the trough, the mud on the path that froze overnight and thawed by noon and froze again by dark. Thomas was 5 weeks old and showing every intention of being loud about his opinions for the foreseeable future. He'd put on weight. He had his mother's dark coloring, and from what I could see, his mother's stubbornness, which I considered a reasonable inheritance. Delia had hit her stride in the kitchen, which meant the meals at the inn were considerably better than they'd been before she arrived, and several regulars, the ranch hands from the villa spread up the road, the Basque shepherd who wintered in the valley and came in every few days for news and coffee, had started arriving with more reliability than they'd shown when I was cooking. I had not examined my own feelings about any of this. I was 61 years old. I had been alone since my wife Helena died 11 years back, of a fever that took her in 4 days. Our son was in Denver and wrote at Christmas. I had not expected anything else at 61. I had not, I would say, felt entitled to expect anything else. A man does the work in front of him, and that is enough, and I had believed that, or made myself believe it, for 11 years. What I had not accounted for was the particular weight of knowing someone was in the house when I came up from the stable in the dark, the way the kitchen window was lit, the sound of Thomas from upstairs, that flat commanding cry and then quiet, which meant she'd gotten to him. I had not accounted for that, or I had not accounted for how much it would matter. There was one other thing that November, and it needs to be told. A man came through the landing on the 8th, on a Monday, riding a gray horse that had been ridden too hard and not enough. He told me his name, and I don't remember it now. What I remember is that he knew Tom Marsh, Delia's husband, or said he did. He'd heard in Springer that the widow had headed east, and he'd been asking along the road. He told me, with a particular kind of smile, that Tom Marsh had owed him money, and that money passed to the estate. I told him there was no money. He said he'd have a word with the widow directly. I told him she wasn't taking visitors. He said he'd come back. I said don't. He came back 2 days later in the evening, which was when he thought I'd be busy with the supper crowd. I was not busy with the supper crowd. I was standing on the front porch because I had expected him. I won't go into the full particulars of what was said. I'll say that I'm a large man for 61, and that I have spent 22 years keeping a river crossing, and I have some experience with men who ride hard horses and carry that particular smile, and I know the difference between a legitimate creditor and a man who runs down widows and uses the language of debt for purposes that are not about debt at all. He left. He left with a clear understanding of what would happen if he did not stay left. Delia asked me about it later. She'd seen him from the upstairs window. I told her there'd been a man with a questionable claim and he'd ridden on and she wouldn't see him again. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Did you know Tom?" I said I hadn't. I'd never been to Springer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tom was a good man, but he wasn't always careful about who he borrowed from." She paused. "I'd been carrying that since August." I said, "You don't have to carry it anymore." She looked at me in a way I didn't quite know what to do with. I went back outside and finished the last of the evening chores. December was cold all the way through without interruption. The inn was quiet most days. A few hard travelers, cowboys moving between spreads, a family going west that had started late and was paying for it in the cold. I kept the fires going. Delia kept the kitchen going. Thomas was 6 weeks old, then 7, then 8, and growing into the noise he'd been making since birth. We fell into a habit in the evenings. After supper, after the dishes, Delia would come and sit by the main room fire with Thomas, and I would sit at the other end of the settee, and sometimes I would read, and sometimes she would mend something, and sometimes neither of us did anything at all. We talked sometimes, not about anything large mostly, the supply list, the weather, a thing that had happened with a traveler that day. Sometimes she would tell me something about Tom, a small thing, the kind of specific detail a person carries, the way he folded a map, a particular phrase he used when he was annoyed. She talked about him plainly, without drama, the way a person talks about someone they have accepted losing. I listened. One evening she said, "You must think I'm strange. Moving in on a stranger's inn with no warning, and no money, and a baby coming." I said, "You rang the bell. That's what the bell is for." She smiled at that. It was a real smile, not a polite one, and it was the first time I'd seen it at full strength, and I looked down at the book in my hand and did not look up again for a little while. She said, "Harlan." She'd started using my name sometime around the 3rd week. I didn't know when exactly it had happened, but it had. I looked up. She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "I've been in this valley 3 months and nobody in this valley has treated me with more decency than you have. Not just taking us in, it's the way you did it. Like it was nothing. Like it was just what a person does." She looked at Thomas, who was asleep against her shoulder, and then she looked back at me. "I know you think you were just doing what an innkeeper does, but that's not what it was. I want you to know I know that." I didn't say anything for a moment. The fire was low. I needed to put another log on. I said, "You kept the kitchen from being an embarrassment." She made a short sound that was almost a laugh. She said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, but it's what I know how to say." She looked at me a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "I know." The letter to her sister had gone out in November. The sister, Meredith in Caldwell, wrote back in December, and the letter arrived on a Tuesday. I handed it to Delia with the other mail, and she read it at the kitchen table while I was eating my noon meal. When she finished, she folded it and sat very still for a moment. She said, "She has a place for us. Come spring when the road's clear." I said, "Good." She looked up at me. She said, "Is it?" I didn't know what to say to that. I picked up my coffee cup and it was empty, and I set it back down. She said, "Harlan, I need to ask you something directly, because I think if I don't ask it directly, we'll both spend the whole winter dancing around it, and I am too tired for that." I waited. She said, "Is there something here between us, or am I misreading?" I looked at the table. I looked at my empty cup. I looked up at her. I said, "You're not misreading." She was quiet for a moment. Thomas made a sound from the other room, not distress, just the sound he made when he was waking up from a nap, that low gathering noise before the full declaration. She didn't move to go to him yet. She said, "Then you need to know something. I'm not a woman looking to be kept. I am looking for a partner, a man to stand alongside. I've had that before, and I know what it is and I know what it isn't." She paused. "You are that kind of man. I can see it in the way you run this place. The way you handled that man in November. The way you've handled every single thing that's come through that door." She looked at me steadily. "I just need to know if you're willing." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I'm 61 years old. I've been running this crossing alone for 11 years. My back goes out if I straighten too fast, and I'm a worse cook than you, and I'm not much for conversation." She said, "I know all of that." I said, "I'm willing." She nodded once with a kind of settled finality, like a thing that had been decided. She stood up to go get Thomas. She stopped at the doorway and she looked back at me. She said, "Good." Then she went to get the boy. I want to say something here because I have been telling this the way it happened, which means in pieces, out of order, and I haven't been explaining it, and maybe I should explain it once. I was not a man who had been waiting. I don't mean that in a hard way. I mean I had genuinely stopped. 11 years is enough time to understand that a thing is over, and I had understood it, and I had built a life around what remained, which was the inn and the ferry and the work and the occasional good company of travelers passing through. That was enough. I had made peace with it. What happened when Delia arrived was not that I started waiting again. What happened was that I understood over those 3 months that the peace I'd made was a smaller thing than I'd told myself it was. Not a lie, just smaller. The quiet of the building hadn't been enough in the way I'd thought it was enough. I hadn't known that until the quiet changed. I don't know how to say it better than that. She didn't go to Caldwell in the spring. She wrote to Meredith in February and explained the situation, and Meredith wrote back a letter that Delia read to me by the fire, and Meredith apparently had the kind of directness that ran in that family, because her letter was essentially a list of specific questions about me and the inn and the financial picture of the enterprise, and at the end it said, and I'm quoting because Delia read it twice, "If he's the kind of man you're describing, D, then you're a fool to leave." We married on the 14th of March in the Foss Ferry in common room, with Celestina Navarro as witness and Paz the ferryman as the other witness, and the Basque shepherd, whose name was Inchausti and who had been coming in for coffee all winter and had formed an opinion about the whole situation, as the unasked-for third witness. Thomas, who was 5 months old and had his mother's dark eyes, and had developed an extremely loud opinion about the sound of the harmonica that Inchausti had brought along in his coat pocket, provided his own commentary throughout. I am telling this from some years past that March. Thomas is in school now, doing well enough, and he has the look of his father about him in certain lights, and Delia sees it and she doesn't flinch. She carries it the way she carries most things, steadily, without drama. The ferry still runs. My back still goes out when I straighten too fast. The chain on the east porch bell has been replaced twice since that October. There is one thing I want to say about what my life is now, and then I'm done. There is a moment in the evening, most evenings after supper, after Thomas is in bed, when the common room is quiet and the fire is down to coals. Delia comes and sits beside me on the settee, not across from me, beside me, close enough that I can feel the warmth of her, and she puts her head against my shoulder sometimes, and sometimes she doesn't, and either way it's the same. I know what I am to her, a partner, a man who stood alongside. The rock, she called me once, not to my face, to Celestina, and Celestina told me, and I didn't say anything about it to Delia, but I turned it over in my mind for a while. The rock. I was not a young man when she arrived. I was not impressive in any of the ways that men are supposed to be impressive when a woman arrives. I had a river crossing and a wood box and a back that went out. That was what I had. And she looked at all of it, and she looked at me, and she decided I was the man she wanted alongside her. I don't take that lightly, not for a single day. The fire is coals, and the room is quiet, and she's sitting close beside me, and outside the river is doing what it always does, running its brown water toward somewhere else, patient as stone. Thomas is upstairs, making the small noises he makes when he's sleeping. This is the life, the one I stopped waiting for and then found anyway. I don't have a better way to end this than that.